All right, I'm not Eddie Clerk. That's not my real name. You see, digging up dirt on people doesn't exactly make you popular at parties or safe on the streets. So, Eddie Clerk it is. I used to work for a decent-sized network. I had the title, the desk, the whole 9 yards, but the problem with big networks? They've got sponsors, investors, and sometimes those investors have skeletons in their closets. Take a local councilor, for example. I got a tip about him taking kickbacks for city contracts, real estate deals on the side, you name it. I spent weeks piecing together receipts, emails, the whole shebang. I even had video of him accepting a suitcase that I'm pretty sure wasn't full of birthday cards. We were all set to expose him. We had the segment filmed and everything. Then, poof, the story was axed last minute. Legal concerns, I was told. Bull. And don't get me started on the tech firm. It was a big name, the kind of company that even your grandma knows. I found out they had a breach so big it made the Grand Canyon look like a crack in the sidewalk. User data, credit card info, the works all for sale on the dark web. This was the sort of story that could really shake things up. Really make people think twice about where they're typing their secrets. I had emails, documents, enough evidence for a waterproof case, but as soon as it was ready to go live, the story vanished from the lineup. Too controversial, the studio exec said. And then one time I had this solid tip, right? A worker from the local manufacturing plant reached out. He said they'd been dumping all sorts of nasty stuff into the river, chemicals that you wouldn't want anywhere near your drinking water. He was willing to tell me everything. He even wanted to show me where they did it. I had a live interview planned out for the evening news. But next thing I knew, my boss said we were doing a segment on the local shelter instead. And my whistleblower? He suddenly told me he wouldn't do the interview. He said he never told me anything. So just like that, the story's dead in the water. And that's when I knew I had to go freelance. My interest has always been in cybercrime. That's what led me to the dark web. It's not really as shady as people think, but it's not a place for amateurs either. I was going through the usual sites I used to look for leads. The kind, forums where people trade classified info, marketplaces selling anything from fake IDs to stolen art. These are the kinds of places where people can show who they truly are. It was on one of those forums that I found a link to a site called hauntedamazon.com. It promised to give you exactly what you needed at a price you could afford. I figured I'd check it out, see if I could find anything I could use. The website looked like it was ripped straight out of the 90s, like how Amazon used to look when it first started. It was simple HTML code, no fancy graphics or interactive menus, just images with plain text links on a white background. But the listings weren't like anything I've ever seen on Amazon. Each one was more bizarre than the last. The first one caught my eye immediately. It was a picture of an armchair. But calling it just an armchair feels wrong. This thing was massive, like it was made for something much bigger than a human, and it had seen better days. The seat part was all burnt, like a fire got to it, but didn't quite finish the job. A rusty chain was wrapped around its feet. I could see tears along the armrests, big enough that I could see the stuffing poking out. And there were feathers scattered all over it too. They were big, like they came from something much larger than any bird I know. As I looked through the photos, I realized the chair wasn't sitting in someone's living room. It was outside in the middle of the woods somewhere. One picture was a distant shot of the armchair, and I could see the trees around it were burnt, their trunks black and twisted like a forest fire had just passed through. The description under the photo just said, "Owned by an angel. Gone now." That was it. No other explanation. I scrolled down to the next listing, curious about what else was on this site. The one under it just had pictures of jars, a whole bunch of them. Some were old mayo jars with the labels still stuck on them. Others looked fancier with etchings on the sides. I think I even saw a cookie jar in one of the photos. but each of them had a thin layer of black liquid inside. It was thick and shiny, almost like tar. The description under the jars read, "Cannibal Souls." For personal use only, I had no idea what that meant, but I knew there were some real weirdos hiding out on the dark web. I scrolled down some more. The next one looked like a wedding gown for sale. Just a perfectly average wedding dress with big puffy sleeves. It was on a mannequin holding some flowers. Its beady black eyes glinted in the photo. The first photo had it displayed in a store window, right where it should be. But the next photo had the mannequin standing in the middle of a school gym. There was no event going on, no decorations, just this mannequin in a wedding dress, standing there all alone. The next one had it standing beside a lake, but not like it was for a romantic photo shoot. It was just off the path, standing in the mud. The water behind it was dark and almost touching the gown's hem. It gets creepier. Another photo showed it standing right behind a closed casket at what looked like a funeral. Again, there was no one around. And this time, someone had drawn tears running down her eyes with blue Sharpie. The last photo really got me. It was in a kitchen, a normal, everyday kitchen. But there was a man asleep at the table, his head resting on his arms. And the mannequin, still in the wedding gown, was standing right behind him. Under all this, the description just read, "Bells, bells, bells, bells." Now that did freak me out a little. I really didn't know what to make of this site, but it was like I couldn't stop scrolling. I guess I was still hoping for some sort of explanation. Maybe if I scrolled down far enough, I'd find out that this was all just some joke. The next one said, "Normal Mirrors 4, all in the description." The name alone was enough to make me pause. Nothing on this site had been normal so far, and sure enough, the photos proved me right. The first mirror looked ordinary, but the reflection definitely wasn't. There was this little boy, couldn't be older than 6, playing with a toy truck on the floor. But behind him was this huge figure wearing a pig mask, just standing there watching him play. The kid didn't seem to know it was there, but the mask's eyes were fixed right on the boy. The next photo was even weirder. It was another mirror. This one had a fancy gold frame. The reflection showed a woman kneeling down, letting a big dog lick her face, which wouldn't be strange at all, except her face was covered in blood. I didn't know if it was hers or not. She was smiling like this was the most normal thing in the world. Then there was a mirror that made me wonder who was taking these photos. It showed a man trapped under a fallen refrigerator. His arm was stretched out as if reaching for someone just outside the frame. The last photo showed a full-length mirror, like one you'd find hanging in a closet. 2 little girls, maybe twins, were standing in front of it. Their hair was unnaturally long, long enough to stretch deep into the hallway behind them. And they were both wearing pig masks, similar to the figure in the first photo. The listing under that was for a rental in a place called Consumption, SC. I had never heard of it, but what caught my eye were the photos of the house. They were all kinds of wrong. The windows looked like they were melting. The front door was upside down. It actually looked like it was attached to the ceiling instead of the floor. The walls were a mess too. Some were brick, others looked like wood, and none of them were the same color. And the hallways, they were the craziest part. One photo made them look like they went on forever, like some kind of tunnel to who knows where. But then another photo of the same hallway made it look short, as if you could reach the end in a couple of steps. In the middle of this one was a chair lying on its side. My brain couldn't make sense of it. But here's the kicker: the moment I looked away from the screen, I couldn't remember any specific detail about the house. It was like trying to remember a dream right after you wake up. I'd look away, wondering why I felt off. And then I'd look back to see how weird the house was. The only thing in the listing description: McDonald's nearby, that's it. No mention of the house or anything about the town. Just McDonald's. As if that was supposed to make up for living in a place like that. Finally, I got to the last listing. This one had just a single photo. It showed a mailbox. I didn't notice anything weird at first. Just a normal, beat-up mailbox sitting by the side of the road. But as I stared at it, I noticed the shadow it cast. It wasn't straight like you'd expect. The shadow bent unnaturally, like there were too many bends for just a mailbox. And the longer I looked, the more it seemed to move, like the shadow was alive. And not in a good way. The description for this one was short. This one's for you. After reading that, I did what any sane person would do. I clicked off the site and shut down my computer. I didn't sleep that night, and for a while I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The worst part. I've never been able to find that site again, and believe me, I've looked. It's like it vanished the second I closed it. But here's the thing, every now and then I'll see something, an old chair by the side of the road, a wedding dress in a thrift shop, a mirror with a smudge on it, and it'll remind me of something from that site. And every time it happens, I feel like I'm one step closer to finding it again. My name is Cree, and I live with my parents in a city called Cape Town. I can never leave my parents alone because they worry about me a lot, especially after the incident that happened with my sister last year. And what was that incident? You're about to hear it now. When my sister was in high school, she was a moody teenager. She would get upset very quickly, and her mood swings were frequent, just like any other random teenage girl of that time. There was nothing particularly weird about it, but yes, she was extraordinary in some ways. To cover her own expenses, she worked at a nearby bookstore after school. One day when I went to pick her up from school, I overheard her talking quietly to a boy on the sidewalk. Their conversation slowly turned into an argument. I parked my car right in front of them, and she angrily opened the door and sat inside without saying a word. She didn't utter a single word during the entire ride home, and I didn't want to invade her personal space given her mood, so I kept the conversation closed. This scenario took place on a Friday, and the next day I thought it would be the right time to ask her about the previous day's events, whatever she had experienced, good or bad. It was Saturday, so everyone was in a good mood because it was the weekend, so I thought, let's give it a chance. I went to her room quietly. She was sitting at her computer as usual, so I pulled up a chair next to her. I didn't start the conversation directly about the previous day. Instead, I gently asked her what her plans were for today, if she was going out with her friends or something. But she didn't reply to anything, despite my asking many questions. I know dealing with teenagers is challenging, but as an older sister, I felt I could at least try. However, she remained very busy on her computer, reading something intently. I then asked her what she was reading, thinking she could share it with me and it might pass the time. Her answer was quite unsettling. She said she was browsing the dark web, comparing it to how people search for answers on normal websites like Quora on the surface web. She explained that on this dark website, one could find answers to questions you wouldn't find anywhere else. She even mentioned that this website could provide answers to every type of dark question or situation. I didn't understand the site's address as it was strange, but the logo on the website had the words "Hidden Answers" written on it. I didn't know much about the dark web, but I knew that very creepy people use it because it's almost impossible to trace their identities. However, I didn't think my sister was doing anything seriously wrong. Yes, she was exploring a strange corner of the internet, but she wasn't engaging in anything illegal, just reading some questions and answers, which I thought was okay. As I said, she was a teenager, and it's natural for teenagers to have weird thoughts at that age, so I let her be and didn't see any harm in what she was doing. In fact, to bond with her better, I even asked her how I could browse the same website and see if I could find anything interesting or relevant there. She taught me how to navigate the site, and later I opened it on my laptop in my room. The first question I saw left me utterly shocked. Someone had posted on the site, asking for advice because they had just killed their mother and didn't know how to dispose of the body. At first I thought this website was some kind of joke. How could there be such bizarre things? And if there were, what was my sister doing on it? But as I was thinking this, there was a reply to that conversation that was incredibly extreme. The person answering suggested cutting the body into very small parts to make it easier to hide or dispose of. They advised feeding the pieces to a stray dog, and if any parts remained, burning them with kerosene or petrol. I was horrified by what I was reading. Later I found out that the person replying was a woman because she mentioned that the same methods she was describing were what she had used to dispose of her husband's body, and she had never been caught. After seeing all this, I was terrified. I immediately logged out, disconnected from the internet for the day, and didn't disturb my sister that night as she was already asleep. However, as an older sister, I definitely wanted to warn her about everything I had just experienced. It was really bizarre, and she shouldn't be on that website. The next day was Sunday, and we went grocery shopping as usual. While shopping, I told her about my experience and advised her to stay away from that website because it was full of really messed up people. After hearing my concerns, she reacted very strangely. She started laughing and told me, "Are you going to tell me what I should and shouldn't do with my life now?" My younger sister was very stubborn and never listened to anyone, which often got her into trouble. But what could we do? If she wasn't willing to listen, it was her choice. We could only guide her, but it was up to her to follow it. Hearing her harsh reply really hurt me, and I realized that there was no point in trying to convince her she wouldn't understand. When I think back to this story now, and as I share it with you, I can't help but wish I had somehow convinced her. Maybe then she would still be with us today. Our lives changed forever after that day. I haven't mentioned my younger sister's name until now, but I think the time has come. Her name was Casey. On Sunday night, she went to a friend's house for a sleepover, and during that time I was having dinner with my parents. During the dinner conversation, my mom suddenly mentioned that she had a gut feeling that Casey was involved in something wrong, and we were unknowingly ignoring it. After our dinner discussion ended, I went to Casey's room as usual to tidy up and make it comfortable for her when she returned. While cleaning her room, I found some very strange items under her bed. There was a long rope, many burnt candles stored in a box, and several charred pages with unknown writings. All these things were kept inside a small wooden box. Despite examining the pages closely, I couldn't understand what was written on them. After discovering these things, I rushed to my parents, expressing my concern. I told them what I had found, but didn't know what was going on in Casey's life. My parents, especially my mom, were very sensitive to the situation. She was panicking, acting as if she didn't know how to help her daughter. Seeing them in such a state, I realized they couldn't help Casey, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I went back to Casey's school, arriving earlier than usual because I wanted to find the boy who had been arguing with Casey on the sidewalk the previous Friday. Luckily, I found him nearby. I stopped the car in front of him, got him inside, and explained everything we had discovered about Casey. After talking to him, he revealed something horrifying. He told me that he had already broken up with Casey because she wanted him to participate in a satanic ritual she had read about on a dark website. Casey believed that performing this ritual would grant them special abilities to foresee future events, but he didn't want any part of it. That was why they broke up. After telling me this, he left, and it was time to pick up Casey. I picked her up from her usual spot, and as I looked at her in the rearview mirror, I could see that she was behaving strangely. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she literally looked like a devil. I didn't start any conversation with her, and she didn't say a word either. We drove home in silence. Seeing her like this, I realized that she probably hadn't slept at all during the Sunday sleepover. Her eyes were swollen and red, a sign of extreme stress. When she got home, she didn't greet anyone, didn't eat, didn't put her bag down, or change her clothes. She went straight to her room and closed the door. I knocked on her door, shouting that she didn't need to behave this way, that I knew everything, and that she shouldn't continue with these dangerous things. In response, she shouted back, telling me to stop trying to rule her life. She said she wasn't a little girl anymore and wouldn't listen to me. Hearing this, I felt deeply hurt. I realized that until Mom and Dad could handle this situation, I would continue to feel helpless. So I went downstairs to the living room, where I lay on the sofa waiting for my grandmother and mother to return from the market. My grandmother was visiting my mother that day, and I hoped that either Casey would come clean in front of them or they would help her. While waiting, I fell asleep on the sofa. When I woke up, it was to the most horrifying experience our family had ever gone through. I realized that my hands and feet were tightly bound with rope, and my mouth was covered with duct tape. I thought there might be an intruder in the house, and seeing myself in this state, I became even more worried about my sister. As I tried to analyze my surroundings, I started hearing light footsteps coming from the stairs. Slowly, as the footsteps grew closer, I realized it was Casey coming down, but as she approached, she didn't look like the mischievous, innocent girl she used to be. Instead, she was dressed entirely in black, with strange symbols drawn all over her clothes, face, and arms. As she descended the stairs, she was chanting something in a very low voice. Her eyes had turned completely black, and her face looked horribly twisted. I started struggling to free myself, but it was no use. I had never seen her behave like this before. I didn't know if it was really her, if she was possessed, or if she had fully surrendered herself to dark forces. To my horror, she walked into the kitchen, grabbed a butcher knife, and then came towards me. She was no longer chanting, but a wicked grin was plastered across her face. I tried to shout through the tape, but she just laughed at me. She then calmly knelt beside me and whispered, "I told you not to interfere without warning." She plunged the knife into my leg. I screamed in pain, but the sound was muffled by the tape. The last thing I remember before blacking out was her leaning closer and saying, "You should have let me do what I wanted." I woke up in the hospital days later, surrounded by my parents and doctors. Casey had fled after the attack, leaving me for dead. The police are still searching for her, but it's like she vanished without a trace. The Casey I knew is gone, taken over by something far darker, and I will never forgive myself for not saving her in time.